Hi, so I'm going to be presenting on the Georgia state flag as a Confederate monument and its evolution and how it came to be that and what it has represented over the years. Before we get super into it, just to give some background, below here are the Confederate flags. So for context, the Confederate States of America flag is the one on the right, and the Confederate battle flag, which is much more recognizable to most of us, which contains the St. Andrew's cross, is on the left. And both of these symbols have made their way into the Georgia state flag and have been a part of the state flag's history for a bit. Okay, so to start off, we're going to talk about the first state flag of Georgia. So the first state flag is listed. He is down here, and it, as you can tell, is very, very similar to the flag that we just saw that belonged to the Confederate States of America flag. This flag was first established in 1879 following the Civil War. It's, as I said, very reminiscent of the Confederate States of America flag. But when it was created, there was no clear connection and association with the Confederacy. It was more or less just like the state following the Civil War needed a flag, and this is what was decided on. So it wasn't like we need to represent the Confederacy. Okay, so the massive flag change that really made it a Confederate monument was changed in 1956, but just a little context for the lead up to it. So directly following the Civil War, most Southerners wanted to get rid of the Confederate battle flag that contained St. Andrew's cross. They thought it represented division. Essentially, for like most of the post-Civil War era, the Confederate flag went relatively unused. They just thought it was most of the South just thought it was good to move on. The battle flag only became more prominent at the turn of the century when Confederate soldiers' memorials began. So starting in the 1900s, Confederate men who had fought in the Confederacy started to die. So they brought the battle flag back to like memorialize them. When civil rights was picking up in the mid 20th century, this battle flag became also more prominent because it was a way for people to resist the civil rights changes and like the progression that the country was moving towards. And then lastly, the Georgia state flag. The Georgia state legislature was actually highly resistant to the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision that mandated the integration of public schools. So following this decision in 1954, only 2 years later, they changed the flag, and they also started to pass laws to prevent integration. So the flag change actually happened again 2 years after the Supreme Court decision that mandated the integration of public schools. They changed it to this one where it contains the very obvious Confederate emblem. And this is actually from the Confederate battle flag, which is a clear Confederate symbol to represent the white South and had been used at the time within white supremacist organizations. So using this battle flag was on the state flag was definitely a direct dig and white supremacist statement and anger towards civil rights. Along with the state flag change following the court's decision, Georgia began to actually enact all sorts of laws that were in direct opposition to integration. There's a bunch of them, but just a specific one would be that they actually mandated that all public school teachers who were NAACP members had to be fired. So again, this flag, what's happening in Georgia, is a direct attack on civil rights and in clear support of white supremacy. So it eventually did change later in the 2000s, but it did last for a very long time. And then for most of the flag's tenure, it actually didn't face much resistance. And when it did, it was often protests led by Black legislatures or members of the NAACP. So it was really led by people who were very against it. When Atlanta was set to actually host the 1994 Super Bowl and the 1996 Olympics, the governor of Georgia at the time, Governor Miller, toyed with the idea of changing the flag. However, none of his efforts were actually taken seriously. It was a very controversial thing to do, and nothing actually changed. But he was worried about this because Georgia was going to be really in the light with all these massive sporting events happening in Atlanta. And then lastly, a lot of advocates for the flag change actually tried to file lawsuits against the flag. However, none of the court cases were actually successful. So no change for the flag that actually happened within the courts. However, then eventually in 2001, they did decide it was time to change the flag. There had just been a lot of protests around it, and it was clear that it was a very contentious point for the state, and it was just better to get rid of it. So in 2001, this issue was finally brought to the floor. They settled on what became known as the Barnes flag or the compromise flag. Barnes was governor at the time, and he was the one leading the charge behind this. Many legislatures were very intent on keeping the Confederate battle flag and this Confederate symbol because they wanted to contain the state's history. Obviously, it was probably much more malintentioned than that. So this is why on this state flag, you can see there are so many different state flags because they wanted to like commemorate the history. However, this flag did not last very long. And in 2003, the flag actually was brought to the floor again because the 2001 flag, a lot of people were not happy with it. So this was brought back to debate in 2003. Governor Barnes, who had actually decided on the compromise flag in 2001, was no longer in office because he lost his reelection campaign to Governor Perdue. The legislature actually ended up calling for a referendum vote, which decided on a flag that was essentially a spitting image of the state flag pre-1956. It had the Confederate States of America flag with the stars and bars, and it really looks very similar to it. A lot of progressive legislatures recognized that this flag was in fact a compromise, and while not ideal, it was far better than having the Confederate battle symbol, which was really used for white supremacy and really garnered up a lot of hate, where this was much less explicit, but it was definitely a compromise and still a Confederate symbol. So this is the state flag. As you can see, it looks very similar to the Confederate States of America flag that we had been looking at before. This was voted into law in 2004, and it actually still flies over the Georgia State Capitol today. So this is still the flag that the state uses. And then moving on to the conclusion. So essentially, this new flag has not faced too much resistance since its establishment. It actually has been relatively accepted. In fact, since the change in 2004, the issue of like the Georgia state flag has actually stayed out of the news, which it hadn't prior to the change in actually 2001 when it still had the Confederate battle emblem. Even though the flag still contains Confederate symbolism, it's not overtly so. So like even the most well-intentioned progressives might not realize the flag's connotation. So nothing has actually changed it. And while I think this flag obviously needs to change after having studied this a lot and my analysis of the flag and of like the politics and repercussions in Georgia, I think that it's not going to be talked about in the Senate races that are coming up or the governor races, because I think it's so contentious, and Georgia has a lot of other progressive legislation that needs to be passed that a lot of progressives within the state want to work on, that I think this issue is going to take a backseat for a while, even though there's still Confederate representation on their flag. However, it's not as obvious because people don't really know about the Confederate States of America flag, but it is still there and it is still flying over the state capitol. And while it's not obvious, I think it's super important that we're all aware of this and something that should change in the future. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen and what would be the most politically like savvy and like best political like judgment way to do it. So that's all. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed this.